Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, The House of Quiet Smiles. Ashcroft House stood at the end of a narrow lane lined with chestnut trees, its pale stone face softened by age and climbing ivy. The place had the air of careful respectability, like a man who always dressed correctly, always spoke politely, and never allowed his feelings to show. Even the garden seemed disciplined, trimmed hedges, straight gravel paths, and flower beds arranged with deliberate symmetry. Hercule Poirot approved of symmetry. It pleased his sense of order. Yet as the motorcar rolled to a stop before the front steps, he felt at once that the harmony here was only a surface. Underneath, something jarred, like a note played slightly out of tune. Margaret Harrington came out to greet him herself. She was elegantly dressed, though her eyes were tired. She gave Poirot a smile that tried to be warm, but did not quite reach the corners of her mouth. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, taking his hand. "How kind of you to come." Poirot bowed with his usual little flourish. "Madam, for you it is always a pleasure. But you wrote to me with urgency. You said there was, how did you put it, a weight upon your mind." Margaret's fingers tightened around his for a moment. "Yes. A weight. But perhaps it is foolish. Nerves, only nerves." Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. He had heard that phrase many times. People used it to cover all manner of realities: fear, guilt, dread, and sometimes danger. He followed her into the hall. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and old roses. Everything looked in perfect order: polished banisters, framed portraits, a vase of fresh tulips placed at precisely the right angle upon a side table. The care was obvious, and yet to Poirot it felt almost aggressive, as if tidiness were being used to keep something else from escaping. A maid took his coat. Margaret led him into the drawing room, where a fire burned even though the day was mild. The flames crackled too sharply, like a nervous laugh. Lionel Harrington rose from an armchair by the window. He was a tall, well-built man in his 50s, with iron-grey hair and a gentleman's manner. His handshake was firm, his smile measured. "Poirot," he said. "We are honored. Margaret spoke highly of you." "Ah, Monsieur Harrington," Poirot replied smoothly, "it is always agreeable to be spoken highly of. One cannot say the same of all occasions." Lionel chuckled politely, but his eyes did not soften. Poirot marked the detail: a man who laughed with his mouth, not with his heart. They exchanged the usual civilities. Tea was brought in, thin china cups with a delicate blue pattern. The maid placed the tray down with care, yet her hands trembled slightly. She tried to hide it, but Poirot noticed. He always noticed. Margaret poured the tea. Her hands were steady, but she poured a fraction too quickly, spilling a single drop on the saucer. She stared at it for a second too long, as if it mattered far more than it should. Poirot accepted his cup, inhaled the aroma, and then, quite deliberately, did not drink. He set the cup down again. A small test, a small observation. Margaret's eyes flicked to it, then away. Lionel did not react. The maid's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly before she left. "A charming house," Poirot said. "It has the air of, how do you say, good breeding." Margaret smiled again. "It has been in Lionel's family for generations." "And your son, he lives here also, yes?" Poirot asked casually, as if asking about the weather. Margaret's teapot paused in midair. Lionel's jaw tightened. "Yes," Lionel said at last. "Edward is here." Poirot watched the moment carefully. A name is a mirror, it shows what is hidden. When people speak of the one they love, the voice warms. When they speak of the one they fear, the voice alters. Here, both parents had changed in different ways. Margaret's hesitation was emotional. Lionel's was guarded. "Edward is your only child?" Poirot asked gently. Margaret's eyes shone. "Yes. Our only one. He is everything to us." Lionel's fingers tapped once on the arm of his chair. "He is a good boy," he said, as though reciting a fact rather than sharing a feeling. Poirot inclined his head. "It is a great responsibility, to be everything." Margaret flinched slightly at that. Poirot filed it away with the rest. A moment later, footsteps sounded in the corridor. A young man entered the drawing room. He was of medium height, slim, with dark hair neatly combed. There was a gentleness to his expression and a certain intelligence in his eyes. Yet there was also something else, a restraint, a carefulness, as though he had learnt not to take up too much space in the world. "Mother," he said, and kissed Margaret's cheek. Then he turned to Lionel. "Father." Lionel nodded. "Edward. This is Monsieur Poirot." Edward's face lit with polite interest. "The famous detective?" "We are honored, sir." Poirot smiled. "Famous, perhaps. But what matters is that I am useful." Edward laughed softly. It was a genuine sound. Poirot liked him at once. They spoke for several minutes about harmless matters, London, the train service, the garden. Edward's manners were impeccable, his tone warm. Yet Poirot noticed his eyes, they moved around the room more than necessary, and not in idle curiosity. It was the scanning of someone who checks doors, windows, faces. Someone who listens for danger. At one point, Edward reached for the sugar bowl. His hand paused just above it, then he took it anyway. The pause was tiny, less than a heartbeat, but Poirot saw it and understood what it meant. Suspicion. When Edward left the room, Margaret watched him go with an expression that was almost pain. Lionel stared into the fire. Poirot set down his cup with care. "Madam," he said softly, "you have invited me here. You have said it is nerves. But it is not only nerves. There is fear." Margaret's breath caught. Lionel's eyes sharpened. "Fear?" Lionel repeated. "Of what?" Poirot looked at both of them. "Of something that cannot be spoken aloud, perhaps. Of something that lives in the corners of this house, behind the smiles." Margaret's hand clenched in her lap. "He has been unsettled," she whispered. "Edward?" Poirot asked. "Yes." Margaret's voice trembled. "He says there are strange looks, strange silences. He thinks someone dislikes him." Lionel snorted. "Nonsense. He reads too much. He imagines slights." Poirot's gaze moved from Lionel to Margaret and back again. "Monsieur Harrington," he said mildly, "sometimes imagination is a gift. It warns us when our eyes refuse to see." Lionel's mouth tightened. "You think someone intends harm to my son?" Poirot's voice remained calm. "I think your son is the center of something emotional, perhaps something practical. In such cases, madam, monsieur, harm is never far away." A long silence followed. The fire crackled. Outside, a bird called sharply from the trees, then fell quiet. Margaret leaned forward. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, very low, "if something happens to Edward, I do not think I could survive it." Poirot looked at her with something like pity and something like caution. "Madam," he said, "it is possible that you are not the only one who feels that way." That evening, when Poirot was shown to his guest room, the house seemed to hold its breath. The corridor was dim, lit by a single lamp. Shadows lay in the corners like waiting thoughts. Poirot stood for a moment by his door and listened. From somewhere far off, he heard a quiet sound, like a suppressed sob. Then silence. He entered his room, closed the door gently, and set his suitcase down with careful precision. "This house," he murmured to his reflection as he straightened his tie, "is too tidy. Too controlled. And when people control too much, it is because something inside them is desperate to escape." He turned out the lamp. And in the darkness, Ashcroft House remained outwardly peaceful, while beneath its quiet smiles, something dangerous began to move. Chapter 2: A Cry in the Dark. The night settled over Ashcroft House like a heavy curtain. Wind brushed against the windows, whispering secrets no one wished to hear. Within its walls, the household drifted uneasily toward sleep, each person alone with their thoughts and their fears. Hercule Poirot lay awake in his guest room, hands folded neatly over his chest, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the ceiling. He did not sleep easily in unfamiliar houses, especially those that breathed like living creatures. Ashcroft House breathed slowly, as though listening. From somewhere deep within the building came a soft creak. Poirot's eyes opened fully. He did not move at once. He waited. Counted the seconds. The sound came again, a cautious footstep, then another. Someone was awake. A door whispered open. A pause. Then the faintest sound of movement along the corridor. Poirot rose silently, slipped into his slippers, and opened his door just enough to peer out. The hallway was dim, lit only by a distant lamp. At the far end, a figure moved slowly toward the east wing, toward Edward's room. Poirot did not follow immediately. He waited again. Then, just as he took one careful step forward, a scream tore through the house. It was sharp, raw, filled with terror. Poirot moved at once. Doors flew open. Footsteps thundered. Someone cried out Edward's name. The quiet dignity of Ashcroft House shattered into chaos. When Poirot reached the bedroom, he found Margaret on her knees beside the bed, her hands shaking violently. Lionel stood frozen near the door, his face drained of color. The maid, Lucy, hovered near the wall, her hand pressed to her mouth. Edward lay on the floor. His body was twisted slightly to one side, his breathing shallow and uneven. A shattered glass lay beside him, its contents soaking into the carpet. A bitter smell clung to the air. Poirot knelt immediately. "Do not touch him," he said firmly. Margaret sobbed. "Edward, oh God, Edward!" Poirot placed 2 fingers lightly against the young man's neck. A pulse, weak, but present. "He lives," Poirot said quietly. "But only just." Someone ran for the doctor. The house trembled with panic, yet Poirot remained calm, his mind already working. He surveyed the scene. The glass was on its side, not dropped, but placed, then knocked over. The liquid had been partly consumed. The bedside table held nothing else unusual. No note. No bottle. Poirot glanced at the window. It was closed, latched from the inside. The curtain stirred slightly, though there was no wind. "He drank something," Margaret sobbed. "Someone has poisoned my son." Poirot turned to her gently. "Madam, please. Breathe." Minutes later, the doctor arrived, breathless and pale. He examined Edward quickly, administered something from his bag, and gave instructions in a clipped voice. It was poison, he confirmed quietly. A mild one, thankfully. A stronger dose would have killed him. Margaret collapsed into a chair. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would anyone?" Poirot rose slowly. "That," he said, "is the question that matters most. Edward was carried back to his bed. The household gathered in the drawing room once more, but now the warmth of the fire did nothing to ease the tension. Lionel paced. This is madness. Someone must have broken in. Poirot shook his head. There is no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked. The window secured. Then how? Lionel demanded. Poirot's voice was quiet but firm. The poison was administered from within the house. A stunned silence followed. Margaret shook her head violently. No. No, that's impossible. Poirot turned to her gently. Madam, sometimes the most terrible dangers are closest to us. Lucy let out a small, strangled sound. I didn't do anything, she whispered. I swear. No one has accused you, Poirot said calmly. Yet. He walked slowly to the table and examined the tea service again. The cups had been washed, but not well enough. A faint residue clung to one rim, barely visible. Poirot did not touch it. Who prepared the tea this evening? He asked. I did, Lucy said. As I always do. And who brought it to the drawing room? I did. Did anyone else touch it? Lucy hesitated. Miss Clara came in briefly. She said she wanted to speak with Mrs. Harrington. Margaret stiffened. Clara? She was only asking about Edward. Where is Miss Clara now? Poirot asked. In her room, Lionel said. She was unwell earlier. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Did Edward drink tea tonight? He asked. Yes, Margaret said faintly. Before bed. Did he complain of anything unusual? She hesitated. He said it tasted different. But I told him it was his imagination. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Imagination, he murmured. So often blamed. Hours passed. The doctor remained with Edward, whose condition stabilized but did not improve. He drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring incoherently. At last, near dawn, he stirred. Poirot was called at once. Edward's eyes fluttered open. They focused slowly, painfully, on the small figure at his bedside. Mr. Poirot, he whispered. Yes, my friend. I am here. Edward swallowed with difficulty. I thought I was going to die. Poirot leaned closer. You are safe now. But you must tell me, did you see who gave you the drink? Edward's brow furrowed. His breathing quickened. I don't know. I thought it was safe. Poirot waited patiently. There was someone outside my door, Edward whispered. I heard crying. Poirot's eye sharpened. Crying? Yes. Soft, like someone trying not to be heard. Did you see who it was? Edward shook his head weakly. No. But I know it was a woman. Poirot straightened slowly. Thank you, he said gently. You have been very brave. Edward's eyes closed again. As dawn crept through the curtains, Poirot stood alone in the corridor. The house, once neat and orderly, now felt like a stage after tragedy, everything in place, yet forever changed. A woman had cried in the night. A man had nearly died. And someone within these walls had chosen poison over truth. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. The attempt has failed, he murmured to himself. But it will not be the last movement of this little drama. He looked down the corridor toward the bedrooms, toward secrets carefully locked away. Now, he said softly, we begin to understand why someone wanted him silenced. And somewhere within Ashcroft House, fear stirred once more. Chapter 3, Whispers Behind Closed Doors. Morning came reluctantly to Ashcroft House, as though the sun itself hesitated to shine upon what had occurred during the night. Pale light filtered through the tall windows, revealing a house that looked unchanged, yet felt entirely different. Every corridor seemed to listen. Every door appeared to guard a secret. Hercule Poirot had not slept. He sat in a high-backed chair near the window of his guest room, hands folded neatly over his cane, eyes half-closed in thought. Below him, the garden lay perfectly arranged, the dew resting gently on the roses like innocent tears. Innocence, Poirot reflected, is often the most carefully maintained illusion. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he said. The door opened to reveal Margaret Harrington. She looked as though she had aged several years overnight. Her hair was loosely pinned, and her eyes were rimmed with red. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "Edward is awake." Poirot rose at once. "How does he fare?" "He is weak, but alive. The doctor says he may recover fully, if no complications arise." Poirot inclined his head. "That is good news, madam." "Very good." They walked together down the corridor. The house was unusually silent, as though the walls themselves feared making a sound. As they passed Edward's door, Margaret hesitated. "He keeps asking why someone would wish to hurt him," she whispered. "I have no answer." Poirot studied her profile. Her expression was tender, yet beneath it lay something tightly restrained. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the truth is too heavy to lift all at once." Inside Edward's room, the curtains were drawn back slightly. Sunlight touched his pale face. He looked fragile now, stripped of the quiet confidence he had worn before. "Mr. Poirot," he said faintly. "You stayed." "I would not leave before the story is told," Poirot replied. Edward attempted a smile. "Then I suppose I must help you tell it." Poirot pulled a chair close to the bed and Saturday. "Tell me," he said, "had you been afraid before last night?" Edward hesitated. "Yes." "Of what?" "Of someone close to me." His fingers clenched the sheet. "I began to feel watched. Judged. As if my very existence troubled someone." Poirot nodded. "And you said you heard crying?" "Yes." "Soft crying. Like someone breaking inside." Poirot leaned forward. "Edward, listen carefully. Had you taken anything before you fell ill? Tea, medicine, wine?" Edward thought for a moment. "I drank the tea Mother brought earlier." "Nothing else?" Margaret inhaled sharply, then covered it with a cough. Poirot noticed. "You are sure it was your mother who brought it?" he asked gently. Edward frowned. "I thought so. But now I'm not certain." Someone stood in the doorway. "I assumed it was her." "Did you see her face?" "No." Poirot nodded slowly. "That will be all for now," he said kindly. "Rest." As they left the room, Margaret gripped Poirot's sleeve. "You think I did this?" she whispered. "I think nothing yet," Poirot replied. "But I observe everything." Her eyes filled with tears. "I would never harm my son." "Sometimes," Poirot said softly, "harm is born not of hatred, but of fear." Later that morning, Poirot requested to speak with Clara. She arrived in the small sitting room near the garden, pale and tightly composed. She was younger than Edward by several years, with fair hair pulled back too severely, as though softness were forbidden. "You wish to see me?" she asked. "Yes, mademoiselle." "Please, sit." She did so, folding her hands in her lap. "You are fond of your cousin?" Poirot asked. "I care for him deeply," she replied at once. "Too quickly." "In what way?" Her lips parted, then closed again. He is kind. He listens. Many people listen, Poirot said. Not all inspire such devotion. Her gaze flickered. He understands me. Poirot nodded. Understanding can be dangerous. It awakens emotions we prefer to keep hidden. Clara stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Do you not? Poirot's voice remained calm. Last night, someone cried outside Edward's door. Colour drained from her face. That could have been anyone, she said quickly. Indeed. But it was a woman. She stood abruptly. This is absurd. Poirot did not stop her. Mademoiselle, he said quietly, truth does not chase us. It waits. She left the room almost running. Poirot sighed and turned toward the window. Outside, the garden path showed faint marks, footprints half erased by morning dew. He bent to examine them. Small feet. Light steps. A woman's steps. Later, Poirot spoke with Lionel Harrington in the study. You believe someone inside this house is responsible, Lionel said flatly. I do. And you suspect my wife. Poirot chose his words carefully. I suspect pain. I suspect fear. And I suspect love that has gone too far. Lionel's jaw tightened. Margaret would never harm Edward. Poirot studied him. Would you? The question struck like a blade. I would do anything to protect my family, Lionel said after a long pause. Even lie? Poirot asked gently. Lionel looked away. By afternoon, the house felt heavier still. Edward slept fitfully. Clara did not leave her room. Margaret wandered aimlessly, wringing her hands. And Lionel sat alone, staring at nothing. Poirot walked the corridors again, noticing details others overlooked, a missing teaspoon, faint smudges on a door handle, a window unlatched and then carefully closed again. Nothing shouted guilt. Everything whispered it. As evening approached, Poirot stood at the foot of the staircase, deep in thought. The poison had been mild, deliberately so. The victim had been chosen carefully. And the act itself, hesitant. This was not a murder of rage. It was a crime of conflict. Of love twisted by fear. Poirot's eyes narrowed. There are two hearts beating in this crime, he murmured. One bold, one broken. Behind him, somewhere in the house, a door creaked softly. The game was far from over. And the truth, still fragile, waited to be disturbed. Chapter 4, The Mask of Calm. The fourth day at Ashcroft House dawned beneath a pale sky, as though the world itself hesitated to awaken fully. A thin mist lay across the garden, curling around the hedges and softening the edges of the estate. From a distance, the house appeared peaceful once more, but within, the air remained heavy with unspoken truths. Hercule Poirot stood near the front window, hands clasped behind his back, observing the gravel path where faint footprints still lingered. They had not fully disappeared, though someone had tried to sweep them away. Truth, Poirot murmured, is most revealing when one attempts to erase it. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Monsieur Poirot? It was Lucy, the maid. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, and her hands twisted nervously in her apron. Mrs. Harrington asked if you would join her for breakfast. In a moment, Poirot replied gently. Tell me, Lucy, how long have you worked in this house? Nearly 6 years, sir. And in that time, have you ever known such unrest? She shook her head. Never. It was always peaceful. Peaceful, Poirot repeated softly. And yet peace does not break so suddenly without a reason. She swallowed. Everyone loved Master Edward. Yes, Poirot said quietly. Sometimes love is the sharpest blade of all. Lucy blinked, uncertain, then hurried away. The breakfast table was set with precise elegance. Margaret sat stiffly at one end, her hands folded as though in prayer. Lionel sat opposite, his eyes fixed on his plate. The space where Edward usually sat remained empty. Poirot took his place calmly. "I visited Edward earlier," he said. "He sleeps." His strength returned slowly. Margaret exhaled with relief. "Thank God." Poirot watched her closely. "Madam, I must ask you something difficult." She nodded stiffly. "I expected as much. Did you ever fear your son might leave you?" Her fingers tightened around her teacup. "Every mother fears that." "Not in the same way," Poirot replied. "Some fear loneliness. Others fear discovery." The cup rattled softly against the saucer. "You speak in riddles," she said. "Then let me be clear," Poirot said calmly. "Edward is not your biological son." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lionel looked up sharply. "What nonsense is this?" Margaret's face drained of colour. For a moment, she seemed unable to breathe. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. Poirot met her gaze steadily. "Because of the way you love him, with devotion touched by fear. Because of the way you watch him, not as a mother watches a child, but as a guardian watches a secret." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. "I never meant to hurt him," she said faintly. "I know," Poirot replied gently. "But fear is a dangerous companion." She lowered her head. "He was my sister's child. She died in disgrace. I took him in, told the world he was mine. If the truth came out—" "Your reputation," Lionel said bitterly. "Our name." Margaret looked at him, eyes blazing. "I did it for us." Poirot observed the exchange with careful interest. "But you did not poison him," he said softly. Margaret shook her head vehemently. "Never." "Then why did you help someone who did?" Her breath caught. What do you mean?" "You protected the poison," Poirot said. "You ensured it could not be traced. You cleaned the cup. Tears spilled freely now. I was afraid. When I realized what Clara had done, I panicked. I thought if Edward lived, everything would be exposed." Lionel rose abruptly. "You helped her." Margaret's voice broke. "I never wanted him harmed. I only wanted to protect our family." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Fear can make accomplices of the kindest souls." Later that afternoon, Poirot found Clara in the small garden behind the house. She sat on a bench, staring at the earth beneath her feet. "You are waiting," Poirot said quietly. She flinched. "For what?" "For this moment." She looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt him." "I know." "I only wanted him to stay," she whispered. "He was going to leave. To travel. To meet someone. I couldn't bear it. So you poisoned him." She shook her head violently. "Not to kill. Never to kill. I only wanted him weak, dependent, unable to leave me." Poirot's eyes softened. "You see now how dangerous that love was." "I loved him," she sobbed. "You loved what he gave you," Poirot corrected gently. "Safety. Meaning. Hope." She covered her face. "I didn't know it would be so strong." "But you did know it was wrong," Poirot said quietly. She nodded. That evening, Edward awoke fully for the first time. His voice was stronger, though still soft. Poirot sat beside him. "You have been very brave," he said. Edward smiled faintly. I don't feel brave. Bravery is rarely a feeling, Poirot replied. It is a decision. Edward hesitated. Was it someone I loved? Poirot met his eyes. Yes. Tears welled. Then I forgive them. Poirot studied him with quiet admiration. That is a rare strength. Outside, dusk settled once more over Ashcroft House. The truth had begun to surface, but the final reckoning had yet to come. For though one heart had acted, another had allowed it. And somewhere in the silence, guilt still waited to be named. Poirot stood by the window as night approached, his reflection faint in the glass. Soon, he murmured, the final piece will fall into place. And when it did, no one in that house would remain unchanged. Chapter 5: The Weight of Truth. The evening settled over Ashcroft House with a quiet heaviness, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the sorrow that lingered within. Lamps were lit early, casting soft golden pools across the rooms, yet no warmth reached the hearts of those who moved through them. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the drawing-room, his small frame upright and composed, his eyes half-closed in contemplation. The truths uncovered so far circled his thoughts like restless birds, refusing to settle. He had uncovered motives, emotions, and fear, yet something remained unresolved. Truth, he knew, rarely stood alone. A soft knock disturbed the silence. "Come in," he said. Lionel Harrington entered slowly. His shoulders sagged, the confidence he once wore now stripped away. He closed the door behind him with careful precision. "I suppose you know everything now," Lionel said quietly. Poirot regarded him kindly. "I know enough to understand that this house has been living with secrets for a long time." Lionel exhaled sharply. "I never wanted this. None of it." "And yet," Poirot replied gently, "you allowed it to grow." Lionel sank into a chair. "Margaret loved that boy as if he were her own. I didn't stop her. I told myself it was kindness." Poirot tilted his head. "But kindness without truth becomes a lie that poisons slowly." Lionel stared at the floor. When Edward spoke of leaving, everything began to fall apart. "Yes," Poirot said softly. "People fear loss more than guilt." Lionel looked up suddenly. "You think I helped her?" Poirot met his gaze. "You knew more than you admit." The silence that followed was confession enough. "I didn't give the poison," Lionel whispered. "But I knew where it was kept. I told Clara once, foolishly, that a small dose would only make someone ill. I never imagined she would act on it." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet you said nothing when Edward fell ill." "I panicked," Lionel said hoarsely. "I thought if he died, everything would end. No exposure. No shame." Poirot stood. "Monsieur Harrington, silence can be as dangerous as action." Later that evening, Poirot requested that everyone gather in the sitting room. Margaret arrived first, her face pale but composed. Clara followed, eyes downcast. Lionel came last, his expression grave. Edward remained upstairs, still weak, but awake. Poirot stood before them all. "Tonight," he began, "we will speak plainly. No more shadows. No more half-truths." He turned to Clara. "You loved Edward deeply," he said. "But your love was fear dressed in affection. You believed you would lose your place in this house if he left." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted him to stay." "You gave him poison," Poirot said calmly. "A small amount, measured carefully. You believed it would weaken him, not kill him." Clara nodded, sobbing. "I didn't know it would be so strong." Poirot turned to Margaret. "And you, madam, discovered what she had done." Margaret trembled. I saw the bottle. I knew what it meant. You cleaned the cup, Poirot said quietly. You removed the evidence. Yes, she whispered. I thought I was saving him. Saving us. Poirot's voice softened. You were saving the lie. Margaret collapsed into a chair, overcome. Poirot then turned to Lionel. And you, monsieur, you knew something was wrong long before that night. Lionel nodded slowly. I suspected Clara was unstable. I saw how she watched Edward. But I did nothing. Because exposure would destroy the life you built, Poirot said. Lionel closed his eyes. Yes. A heavy silence filled the room. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. You see, he said quietly, this was not one crime, but many small ones. Fear. Silence. Pride. Each played its part. He paused, then added, but one question remains, why did Edward survive? They looked at him, confused. Poirot continued, because the poison was weaker than intended. And why was that? Clara raised her head slowly. Because I hesitated. I diluted it. Poirot nodded. At the last moment, your conscience spoke. She began to cry openly. Love tried to stop you, Poirot said softly. Even as fear pushed you forward. A quiet knock came at the door. Lucy entered. Mr. Poirot? Edward is asking for you. Poirot nodded and turned to the others. We are not finished. But the final truth must come from him. He climbed the stairs slowly. Edward lay propped against pillows, his face pale but alert. You wanted to see me, Poirot said. Edward nodded. I heard voices, raised voices. Poirot sat beside him. You deserve the truth. Edward listened as Poirot spoke, his expression shifting from confusion to sorrow. When it was finished, tears slid silently down his cheeks. I loved them all, he whispered. And they loved you, Poirot said gently. But love without honesty becomes something cruel. Edward swallowed. What happens now? Poirot hesitated, then answered honestly. The law will have its say. But it will not undo what has been done. Edward closed his eyes. I don't hate them. Poirot touched his shoulder lightly. That is your strength. As night settled once more over Ashcroft House, Poirot stood alone in the hallway. The house felt quieter now, not peaceful, but emptied of its lies. Yet something still troubled him. The plan had been exposed. The poison explained. The guilt confessed. And yet, one final detail remained unsettled. The dose had been carefully measured. Too carefully. Someone had known exactly how much would not kill. Poirot's eyes narrowed. No, he murmured. There is still one truth hiding. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. And somewhere, unseen, the final piece of the puzzle waited to be revealed. Chapter 6, The Quiet Calculation. The house slept uneasily that night, as though every wall remembered the secrets whispered within it. Moonlight spilled across the corridors in pale ribbons, touching doors that concealed truths yet unspoken. Ashcroft House had grown weary of lies, and still one remained. Hercule Poirot did not sleep. He sat upright in his chair, his small frame perfectly still, his mind alive with motion. The pieces of the puzzle lay before him, neatly arranged, yet one piece refused to fit. The poison. The dose. The precision. Someone had known exactly how far they could go. Someone with knowledge. Someone calm. Someone deliberate. A soft creak reached his ears. Poirot looked up as the door opened slowly. Lionel Harrington stood there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. "I thought I might find you awake," Lionel said quietly. Poirot gestured to the chair opposite him. "It seems sleep has abandoned us both." Lionel sat heavily. For a moment, neither spoke. "I keep seeing his face," Lionel said finally. "Edward's. When I thought he might die, I realized how much I had already lost." Poirot regarded him with sympathy. "Guilt has a long memory." Lionel nodded. "I've been asking myself the same question over and over. Why did he survive?" Poirot folded his hands. "Yes. That is the question that refuses to rest." Lionel frowned. "You think it wasn't chance?" "No," Poirot replied quietly. "It was calculation." Lionel stiffened. "Clara confessed." "She confessed a part of the truth," Poirot said gently. "But not all of it." Lionel looked away. "You think someone helped her?" "I think someone guided her," Poirot said. "Someone who understood dosage. Someone who knew exactly how far one could go without killing." Lionel swallowed. "Are you saying?" Poirot's voice softened. "I am saying that knowledge can be as dangerous as intent." Silence fell again. After a moment, Lionel spoke in a hoarse whisper. "I knew about the medicine." Poirot nodded. "Yes. I kept it locked away for years," Lionel continued. "Old prescriptions from when my wife was ill. I remembered the strength, the effect." His hands trembled. "I told Clara once, just in passing, that a small amount would cause weakness, confusion. I never thought that she would use it," Poirot finished. Lionel covered his face. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "And yet," Poirot said gently, "it did." The following morning dawned cold and pale. Edward was sitting up when Poirot entered his room, wrapped in a thick blanket, his eyes clearer now though still tired. "You're looking better," Poirot said. Edward managed a small smile. "I feel lighter. As if something heavy has been lifted." Poirot pulled up a chair. "Edward, I must ask you something difficult." Edward nodded. "I know." "Before all this happened," Poirot said softly, "did you intend to leave this house?" Edward hesitated. "Yes." "For what reason?" "I wanted to start a new life," he said quietly. "I had been offered work in London. A chance to be independent." "And you told your family?" "I told my mother first. She cried. Said she would die if I left." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "I told Clara later," Edward continued. "She begged me to stay. She said she needed me." "And your father?" Edward looked away. "He said it was foolish. That I owed him loyalty." Poirot nodded slowly. "You were trapped." Edward swallowed. "I didn't realize how deeply." Poirot leaned forward. "Edward, on the night you fell ill, did you take the drink willingly?" "Yes." "I thought it was tea." "Did you notice anything strange?" Edward frowned. "It tasted bitter." "But?" "I thought it was my imagination." Poirot's eyes softened. "You trusted too easily." Edward looked ashamed. "I didn't think anyone here would hurt me." Poirot placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That innocence nearly cost you your life." Later that day, Poirot requested to see Clara once more. She arrived pale and trembling, her eyes red from weeping. "You wish to punish me," she whispered. Poirot shook his head. "No. I wish to understand you." She looked at him, confused. "You diluted the poison," Poirot said. "That was not instinct." It was decision. Her shoulders sagged. I couldn't do it, she whispered. I wanted him weak, not gone. Yet someone taught you how to measure it, Poirot said. She hesitated. Who? Tears streamed down her face. Mr. Harrington. Poirot nodded slowly. He never meant for harm, but knowledge once shared cannot be taken back. She sobbed openly now. I never wanted this. Love, Poirot said gently, must never demand sacrifice of another's life. That evening, Poirot gathered everyone once more, Lionel, Margaret, Clara. The atmosphere was heavy with inevitability. You have all played your part, Poirot said quietly. Some through fear. Some through silence. Some through love twisted into possession. He looked at Lionel. You planted the seed. At Margaret. You hid the truth. At Clara. You acted upon it. Each of them bowed their heads. But there is one thing you must understand, Poirot continued. Edward lives because conscience still existed within this house. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The law will come, he said softly. And it must. Margaret sobbed openly now. Lionel looked as though he had aged 10 years. Clara whispered, I never wanted to kill him. Poirot met her eyes. Intent does not erase consequence. Later that night, Poirot stood alone by the window once more. Below, the garden lay silent. The case was nearly complete. Only one final truth remained to be spoken aloud, not of guilt, but of responsibility. And that truth would change everything. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he murmured, we end this. Outside, the moon slipped behind the clouds, as if unwilling to witness what was yet to come. Chapter 7: The Breaking of Silence. Morning came slowly to Ashcroft House, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over a place so heavy with unspoken truth. The air felt thick, pressing against the walls, against the hearts of those within. No one spoke at breakfast. Even the ticking of the clock seemed too loud. Hercule Poirot stood near the window, watching a pale beam of light crawl across the carpet. Today, he knew, the truth would no longer remain hidden. The fragile structure of silence was about to collapse. Behind him, footsteps approached. Monsieur Poirot. It was Edward. He looked stronger now, though his face still carried a quiet sadness. His eyes were thoughtful, older than before. You should not be out of bed yet, Poirot said gently. I needed to be here, Edward replied. I feel as though something is ending. Poirot turned to him. Yes. And endings, my friend, are often painful, but necessary. Edward hesitated. I know something terrible has happened. I feel it in the air. Please, don't protect me from the truth anymore. Poirot studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. The others were summoned to the drawing room once more. Margaret arrived first, pale and trembling. Lionel followed, stiff and hollow-eyed. Clara entered last, her hands clasped tightly as if holding herself together by force alone. The room felt smaller than before. The walls seemed to lean inward, listening. Poirot stood at the center. Today, he said calmly, we bring this matter to its end. Not with anger, but with truth. No one spoke. You have all suffered, he continued. But suffering does not excuse silence, nor does love excuse harm. He turned first to Margaret. You loved Edward as your own, Poirot said gently. Yet when the truth threatened to emerge, you chose secrecy over honesty. You believed that by hiding the truth, you could preserve your world. Margaret nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. I thought I was protecting him. You were protecting yourself, Poirot replied softly. And in doing so, you placed him in danger. She bowed her head. Poirot turned to Lionel. You are a man who values control, he said. You feared chaos more than guilt. You knew of Clara's distress. You knew of the poison. Lionel swallowed hard. I thought I could manage it. I thought if I said nothing, it would pass. Silence, Poirot said, is often louder than confession. Lionel's shoulders slumped. I was a coward. Poirot nodded once. Then he turned to Clara. She looked as though she might collapse. You loved Edward, Poirot said softly. But your love became fear. And fear became obsession. I didn't want to hurt him, she whispered. I just wanted him to stay. I was terrified of being alone. You were not alone, Poirot said gently. But you believed you were. Tears streamed down her face. I never meant for this to happen. And yet it did, Poirot replied. The room fell silent once more. Edward, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward. Stop, he said quietly. All eyes turned toward him. I know what you're going to say, Edward continued. I know what each of you did. He looked at Margaret first. You loved me, but you were afraid of losing your world. Then at Lionel. You feared disgrace more than truth. Finally, he turned to Clara. And you loved me in a way that hurt us both. His voice trembled, but he did not falter. I forgive you, he said. A sharp intake of breath filled the room. Poirot watched closely. This was not weakness, it was strength of a rare kind. But forgiveness does not mean escape, Edward added quietly. You must answer for what you've done. Clara collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Margaret reached for her but stopped herself, as if realizing too late that some gestures could no longer mend what was broken. Poirot stepped forward. The law will come, he said calmly. And it must. But before that, one final truth must be spoken. He turned to Lionel. You knew exactly how much poison would weaken without killing, Poirot said. You learned it long ago, when your wife was ill. You shared this knowledge carelessly, believing it harmless. Lionel closed his eyes. But there is something else, Poirot continued. Something only you knew. Lionel's breathing quickened. You knew Edward was not your son, Poirot said quietly. And yet you claimed him publicly, because admitting the truth would destroy the life you had built. The room seemed to tilt. Edward stared at Lionel in shock. Is that true? He whispered. Lionel's voice broke. Yes. The word echoed like a gunshot. I loved you, Lionel said hoarsely. But you were a reminder of my failure. Of a past I buried. Edward staggered back as if struck. Poirot spoke softly. And when Edward planned to leave, you saw not freedom, but exposure. Silence fell. Finally, Edward spoke again. All my life? I thought something was wrong with me. His voice cracked. But it was never me. Poirot stepped beside him. No, mon ami. It was never you. Tears streamed freely now, tears of grief, of release, of understanding. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. This house, Poirot said, was built on silence. But silence cannot hold forever. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, voices approaching. The authorities had arrived. Poirot turned toward the door, his face solemn. One last act remains, he said quietly. The truth must now walk into the light. As the door opened and uniforms appeared, the weight of the past finally began to lift. But the cost of silence. That would remain forever. Chapter 8, The Quiet Truth. Morning arrived at Ashcroft House not with brightness, but with clarity. The storm had passed during the night, washing the air clean. Pale sunlight touched the windows, gentle and forgiving, as though the world itself wished to begin again. Inside, however, the house stood hushed, emptied of denial, stripped of illusion. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the drawing room, hands folded behind his back. His reflection in the glass seemed older somehow, weighted with all that had been spoken and all that could never be unsaid. Footsteps approached. Edward entered quietly, dressed in simple clothes, his movements careful but steadier than before. His eyes held sorrow, but also resolve. "You wanted to see me," Edward said. "Yes," Poirot replied gently. Before the final curtain falls. Edward sat opposite him. For a moment, neither spoke. "I know the police are downstairs," Edward said quietly. "I heard them arrive." "Yes. They will take them away." "They must." Edward swallowed. "And after that?" Poirot studied him thoughtfully. "After that, life continues. Not as it was, but as it must be." Edward lowered his gaze. "I keep thinking, if I had spoken sooner, if I had left earlier." Poirot raised a hand. "Ah, mon ami. Regret is a cruel companion. It pretends wisdom, but it arrives only when the cost has already been paid." Edward gave a small, broken smile. "You speak as if you've paid such costs yourself." Poirot's eyes softened. "Many times." A quiet settled between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective. "I want to understand," Edward said at last. "Why did they do it?" "All of them?" Poirot inhaled slowly. "Because love, when it fears loss, becomes something else. Your mother feared the truth. Your father feared disgrace. Clara feared abandonment. Each chose silence instead of honesty. And silence almost killed me." "Yes," Poirot said gently. "Silence is a powerful poison." Edward closed his eyes. "Then I forgive them," he whispered. "Not because they deserve it, but because I refuse to carry their fear with me." Poirot nodded, deeply moved. "That, my friend, is courage." Downstairs, the mood was heavy but calm. Margaret sat rigidly on the sofa, her hands folded tightly. Lionel stood near the fireplace, staring into nothing. Clara sat apart, pale and trembling. The sound of measured footsteps announced the arrival of the authorities. Poirot stepped forward. "Before you proceed," he said, "there is something that must be said." All eyes turned toward him. "This was not a crime born of cruelty," Poirot said calmly. "It was born of fear, fear allowed to grow unchecked." He turned to Margaret. "You feared losing your son. To Lionel, you feared losing your reputation. To Clara, you feared being alone." Each bowed their head in silent acknowledgement. "But fear does not excuse action," Poirot continued. "It only explains it." The officers approached. Margaret wept quietly as she was guided away. Lionel walked stiffly, his pride finally broken. Clara hesitated at the doorway, then turned back once more. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Edward. He nodded gently. "I know." She was gone. The house fell silent again. Poirot and Edward stood alone in the drawing room, sunlight now flooding the space where darkness had once lingered. "Will you leave this place?" Poirot asked. "Yes," Edward said. "I think I must." "And where will you go?" Edward considered this. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere honest." Poirot smiled faintly. "A good beginning." Edward hesitated. "Will you stay in touch?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "If you ever need a small Belgian with excellent manners and inconvenient questions, you know where to find me." Edward laughed softly, the first genuine laughter in days. Later that afternoon, Poirot prepared to depart. As he stepped outside, he paused, looking back at Ashcroft House. Sunlight now touched the windows warmly, as if the building itself exhaled in relief. Edward joined him at the door. "Thank you," he said simply. Poirot inclined his head. "Live well, my friend. That is the greatest justice." Edward watched as Poirot walked down the path, his figure growing smaller with each step, yet somehow unchanged, dignified, composed, unburdened. The car disappeared beyond the trees. Ashcroft House stood quiet behind him. But it was no longer a place of secrets. Epilogue. Weeks later, Edward stood at a small railway platform, a single suitcase by his side. The air was crisp, the sky wide and open. He breathed deeply. For the first time in his life, he felt free, not from pain, but from fear. The train arrived. As he stepped aboard, he whispered softly, not to anyone in particular, "I choose truth." The train pulled away, carrying him toward a future unburdened by silence. And somewhere, far away, Hercule Poirot allowed himself a rare smile. For justice had been served, not with violence, but with understanding. And that, he knew, was the truest victory of all.